Hello, welcome to today's video where I'm showing you and sharing with you how you can build a landscape painting, and you can work in a similar way as you would with watercolor or acrylic to get really specific things happening within your landscape. Sometimes those inks really do have a life of their own, which is part of the reason that we love them, but we also like to learn a little bit of control as well. So keeping in mind the information that we already know in regards to painting and creating distance and bringing things into the foreground, it's the same idea when we use the inks. So this video is going to show you the process for that. So as you can see, I've already got a pencil sketch in. I don't go too detailed because not all the pencil will get covered up by the inks. Wherever the ink's going to be thinner, you are going to see some of those pencil marks. But to me, that's part of the attraction. So I do advise that if you make any mistakes with your pencil, rather than using a eraser, I would use a cotton bud and just the alcohol, the isopropyl alcohol, on the end of the cotton bud. Mainly because with the eraser I found that it left behind like a residue that the inks went a little bit strange over. Like it was almost like it kind of left like behind this little bit of wax or something. So I would advise using the alcohol and a cotton bud to remove the pencil, and it works quite nicely. What we're doing now is adding some ink for the sky and getting started on doing our background. Whenever I'm doing my initial first layers, I like to just move the ink around, getting it thinned out and quite translucent to start with, and I do that just by moving the paper around, adding a little bit more alcohol or a little bit more ink depending on what I am feeling like it needs. I like to do this in the beginning, and I really thin out my inks to start with. I like to create a thinner sky, like an interesting sky, but not to go as heavy with the pigment. So I'm using lots of isopropyl alcohol there to really get that ink moving around. Sorry about the glare there, but it's unavoidable as I'm tipping it and moving it around. So I just keep moving it, even though there's a point where it's not moving very much, but that's when I really like to keep moving it. You start to get those lines and marks that look really nice. If you're after a smooth sky, then you want to stop once you've got your ink moved around and place it down. Forgot the word there. But I like to get some lines and interesting marks happening in my skies generally. So I just keep adding a little bit more alcohol, and sometimes I let it even run right off the paper as well, depending on how translucent I'm trying to get. Next, I added just a little bit of that salmon color right at the top there. I'm going to create some distance for this path and this image. So I've used some of the paler colors, or I'm going to use some of the paler colors towards the back of the painting where the distance is going to be, and then as I build the painting up with layering these inks on top of one another, I start to get more and more bold and more pigmented as I get towards the foreground of the painting. But before I continue, I just realized I haven't put in my masking fluid, so that's what I'm doing now, just using that cotton bud. I'm adding the masking fluid right onto the paper. And I want that on there because I still want to tackle the ground and the grass and everything in the same way that I did the sky. But if I do that, then I'm going to lose that crispness and clarity of those other areas. So I've just put down the masking fluid that I want to keep white for now. And then I put down some more color, and I'm going to move that around either with a straw by tipping it around, or this lens blower as well. The lens blowers are really good for getting that really organic shape happening, and you can kind of move it around. I kind of like this a little bit more than the hair dryer. I find you have that little bit more control Hairdryer definitely has its purpose, but it does dry it quite quickly as you go as well. I think with this you have a little bit more time to get it moving around. So I was feeling like that pigment was a little bit heavy for my first kind of application, so I'm dabbing some of it away by reactivating it with the isopropyl alcohol, and then just removing some with the paper towel. You'll see me do that a lot. I think that's how I get the really cool mark making in my paintings. It's part of the adding and the removal. You build up these really interesting patterns. So just building up the colors in the background, not thinking too much about color necessarily, because these inks have so many fun colors. I don't want to be restricted to what nature tells me that they should be. So grass should be green, but you know, sometimes you have it where it's yellowed out, or you know, the sun's hit it, or there's like flowers, fields of flowers, or whatever. I will add some green in there later, but for my backgrounds I tend to go really bold and bright with my colors, not really thinking about what the actual colors in the photograph are. So there we go again, just dabbing a little bit more, trying to keep the color that little bit paler towards the horizon line in the distance there. I've thinned it out quite a bit. See, I'm adding that little bit of green, goes right over the top, but trying to let some of those bright colors still sing through a little bit that I put down first. So my colors are getting a little bit deeper and less mixed with alcohol, and that's more in the foreground of the painting though. So now I want to add some real texture, so I'm placing down some bubble wrap, and I do have to leave this for quite a few hours. A little spray on that corner bit there. Otherwise you just don't get the marks that are left behind, so you do have to let it dry. And just before I leave this to dry, I also want to add that little bit of color that's left. I just spritz it with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol before I leave this painting alone for a while. Okay, so we are back. I've got some cool mark making underneath that bubble wrap, so I really like it, but I'm not afraid to go over the top of it. It's only going to come through in little sections. It's just another way to build up your layers and make your painting more interesting. So I'm starting in the background with my lighter colors. So I've used I believe the lemonade on the left hand side, and I'm using salmon on the right. So they're already fairly thin pigmented colors from Ranger. So I'm letting those sit right in the background, a little bit thinner, and it's going to create the distance that I need. So placing some green in there a little bit. It's almost like a washed out gray color because I've mixed it with that salmon. You have to learn a whole new color theory with these inks. The rules don't quite apply the same way as they do with colors when you're mixing them in acrylics and watercolors. Okay, so I'm removing my masking fluid. I have got a little bit of seepage or where I've not covered it properly, but that's okay. As long as I've got the majority of the path outline pretty much saved, I'm happy with that. Just going to wipe off a little bit of the ink that seeped through. I'm not worried too much about having that having seeped through. It just adds a little bit more interest to what would otherwise be a completely bold path. So the next part of the painting involves just building up the layers, adding color, adding alcohol, thinning it out where it gets too heavy and removing it, blowing it around so that it gets really organic. And then sometimes you have to go in with the brush as well to have a little bit of control, create some edges where you need them, and ultimately just build up the layers of the painting. Sometimes you have to remove, sometimes you have to add, sometimes you have to have that little bit more control. So I will let you watch the rest or a little bit more of this in peace and quiet, and I will come back towards the end and give you a few more tips and tricks of what you've seen. So for now, I will pass you over to the music. Okay, so I thought I would come back and give you a few tips on what I've done. So a big thing for me is sometimes I have to go back into areas like you can see on this square right now. The blue wasn't quite right for me. So I'm removing it and then I'm adding a brighter blue right over the top. So sometimes if there's a color that's not working, don't be afraid to take it out and re-add it with a clean brush and a clean palette. So that leads me on to brushwork a little bit. With the brush, I tend to always put it onto my little palette there, which is just a tile. But I quite like using the tile because it's easy to clean. But when I'm trying to get really detailed areas, like right now with the boot, you partly want the ink to dry before you pick it up with the brush, or if you do pick it up when it's wet, you have to give it time to dry. So right now, even though I'm going straight from the palette to the boot, it was almost dry. The ink on the palette was almost dry. So that's how you can get these really tiny marks. So it is a little bit of back and forth because obviously these inks even don't take long to dry. So you have to keep reactivating them with the alcohol, or you can reactivate it with the ink as well, and then you can get in and get some really fine lines. So I also like to add in some fine lines with pen as well, not on all my paintings but just on some. Depends on what the look is that I'm trying to achieve. So these pens work quite nicely on top of the inks. Sometimes the inks do clog up the nib, but you can just run it over a piece of cardboard, a piece of paper, and it works on the inks again right after. So not too big of an issue. You can also use the Posca pens, but I do find that I haven't found a nib that's quite thin enough for me yet with the. And I'm also adding in just a little bit of detail in the grass. That'll also bring all these things into the foreground because all these shapes are a little bit sharper because I've got the nice neat edge. And so anything in the foreground would be crystal clear, and then anything in the background would be less easy to see. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a close-up, and you can see all those marks and different colors that I've had peeking through the grass there. And yeah, just some of the detail. You see some of that bubble wrap. I've tried to leave some of it peeking through as well, so it doesn't take over the painting, but it pops up just every little bit there in between the grasses. I've got some really abstract flowers there at the bottom as well, and just a few marks, just adding in a few blades with the detail of that pen. But I was a little bit bored with all the green colors, so I decided to add in a few brighter ones. So I'm adding in all genre of color of grass that you would never normally see. So right now I'm using the raspberry pink with my brush, and you saw me dab it onto the paper towel just then. That's partly because you need that ink not too runny. So if I've dabbed it into really wet ink and I want to use the brush right away, and give it a little dab onto the paper towel, it soaks up just enough of what I need, and then I can get in and get my thin lines without the ink bleeding or spreading too much when it hits the Yupo. So that's how you can have that little bit more control. So I'm just picking up all different colors from yellow to orange, purples and pinks and reds, just adding a little bit more interest in there. I like color, so I was a little bit bored with the green, and I think it just makes it pop just that little bit more. Then to vary some of the marks, I do add some blobs of ink directly onto the Yupo as well and blow it around with the lens with the colors that I've kind of chosen to brighten it up. And yeah, so there's only a few minutes left of the video, but I will give you a little bit more music just to enjoy this last little bit for you to watch. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully you agree by adding those brighter pieces in the front just made this whole painting seem to come alive. I'm definitely glad that I went ahead and added those brighter ones in there. And hopefully you guys learned a few tricks on how to approach your own landscapes. If you have any questions, let me know and put those in the comments below. Please click subscribe and click that bell button. I would love you to see more videos and more tips and tricks. And I will see you on the next video.